When employees sometimes feel that they've kind of plateaued or they've reached their point where there is no opportunity for growth, then they start to look and leave the organization.
Welcome to my interview series. This is a special conversation with my close friend Arnoldo, or Arnie, from San Antonio ISD. Quite frankly, I really hate performance reviews, but the way Arnie talks about it, I think he has a knack for making it really human and relatable. And I would definitely take a performance review from Arnie. So check it out, and I'll see you on the other side. All right, Arnie, welcome. Thank you for joining me today. I love your background. Where are you right now?
So actually, I'm in our boardroom at San Antonio ISD. We're the third largest school district in San Antonio. So the background that you see here is the background in our boardroom, which shows the skyline and
Oh,
different
wow.
aspects
Yeah.
of the school district. And so I wanted to be able to share that with you all today
Yeah,
because I'm
that's
very
really
proud of
cool.
it. Thank you.
I think one of the things I know is coming up for employers across the country, especially when, so many of our folks are working from home and we're not interacting with them the same way we have. Coaching people and providing kind of feedback and goal setting is just completely different now. What are some of the differences that you're noticing from the way you did it before and the way you do it now?
So I think one of the things that's changed is that appraisers had to find a different way to have those conversations. And again, some of them would say, well, we're not meeting face to face anymore, but you're meeting face to face virtually. And just being cognizant and aware that when you are meeting with an employee about their appraisal or any other performance issues or concerns, or even to give them, some feedback on something maybe they observed, that they're being respectful and then letting the employee know ahead of time, this is what we're going to be discussing, to make sure that there's nobody else around in the background, because sometimes we don't know that, and we want to make sure that that information is still kept confidential, which is what we would expect when you're meeting with somebody in person, but it just being a little bit more attuned to that.
I think one of the other things that I've noticed is that when I do reach out to somebody to provide feedback, especially in kind of a remote environment, I feel like there is a little bit of a heightened intentionality, but also maybe a little bit, it could come across a little bit more formal uh, in this kind of situation. What have you noticed?
Right. So we definitely want to make sure that appraisers are not only giving feedback about growth or refinement, but also giving positive feedback as well. That way, the employee doesn't feel that every time you schedule a conference or schedule a meeting with them about performance, that they're not dreading that conversation, to make sure that they're not thinking every time that interaction happens that it's a negative interaction. And the other thing you want to make sure that your employees know, what, especially like you mentioned, for what's intentionally about it, is making sure that they're prepared for that conversation. So if you're saying it's a check-in, that you're letting them know we're checking in regarding, my observation from yesterday or regarding this project, so that they can have all the materials and information for you to make the best time that you have that's available.
What I'd love to hear is, why is this so important for an organization to develop individuals?
What's important to develop individuals, because we want individuals hopefully to be able to grow in the organization. Individuals that work with our employees, other employees, or work with our students and families, they know them best. And so when we provide guidance and feedback to employees to allow them the opportunity to grow, you're growing your own workforce. So you're not really having to go out as much looking for others that maybe don't know your students or know your population, your families, like the ones that already have those relationships built with them, that the students know, the parents know and trust. But it's also helpful for employees to see that there are opportunities for them to grow, because when employees sometimes feel that they've kind of plateaued or they've reached their point where there is no opportunity for growth, then they start to look and leave the organization. And replacing an employee, regardless of the role that they play in the district, they're all important, but they all have a cost that then has to be assumed by the district in order to retrain somebody, bring somebody back in, and bring them on board. So it's definitely a win-win for the district. It's a win-win for employees, because when employees see that they have that opportunity to grow, they have the opportunity to use their skills in a different area or for a different opportunity, then they're more willing to stay and not be looking around. So the attrition rate isn't as high.
Yeah. And then, just going back to the actual training of the kind of the appraiser role, I think that, I've also been known to just like focus on the document and then hand it off, and we're like, we're going to implement it now. Right. And so you mentioned that, just training the appraisers is so critical for the quality of the data that we're collecting. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you're finding?
Right. So one of the things that we did when we very first implemented the redesign for our appraisals was we felt it was important for there to be calibration for all of the appraisers. So we had very intentional, very focused training for all appraisers, and we made it mandatory for appraisers who were going to be appraising in our school district to go through this mandatory training. That mandatory training was done by myself. When we were doing it, in person, I was the one conducting all of those trainings. Then we ended up creating an online version, but I felt it was important to hear that information from me, so that the information that was being translated to the appraisers and given to them was standardized. There was no vacillation between what somebody else might be providing and what I was providing. So I felt it was important to do that. But it was also important to calibrate and let the appraisers know exactly how to use the instrument, what the way that it was set up to be used. We created rubrics for one part of our appraisal process. And so going through the rubric, explaining to them how the rubric was used, how you move from one to the next was important, so that the same type of ratings and the same way that the instrument was being applied consistently across the district, across employee groups.
What are some tips that you would have for people looking to redesign, but wanting to create something that's an improvement, not something that's more complicated than what they had before?
One of the things that I very first did when I started this process was sit down and have listening meetings with stakeholders, to include appraisers and appraisees. So I met with different groups of employees from all the different employee groups, and met with appraisers and just got feedback from them. And I basically said to them what's working and what's not working, and just heard what they had to say. I think that was really important, because then what I ended up doing was being able to then have some streamlined consistencies across the board. So as we started implementing the process, I would say to them, when I met with employees and I met with appraisers, this is a consistent message that I'm hearing. This is the reason that we're changing certain things, or this is the reason we're keeping certain things, is because across the board we're hearing that this is working or this isn't working. So that was really important. And then the second thing we did after that was then take all the appraisals that we had, which there was a copious amount, laid them out literally physically on a table, and I sat there and started looking at them to see what were the same things that we saw in some and what were the same things that were different. So, for example, for classified employees, paraprofessional employees, and then professional non-teaching employees, I then created different chart tablets that had all the things that were the same, consistent across all classified appraisals. These are the things that are consistent across the paraprofessional. These are consistent across the professional non-teaching. And so when I started having those meetings about what were the things that they felt that needed to stay or that needed to go, we had a kind of a reference guide to say across the board for all classified employees, these are the things that are the same and these are the outliers.
One thing that really stuck out with me as you were explaining that is, the statement, this is the reason we're doing it. How would you provide those kinds of tips to other districts that are thinking about these kinds of systems level changes? How do you actually make sure that you're expressing this is the reason enough to everybody?
Well, again, I think it's listening, and it's being open to hearing criticism and hearing things that are working well. I can tell you that at the beginning there was just a lot of criticism, and I said, and I'm hearing that, I'm taking it in. It's not personal, because again, I wasn't over that process prior to me moving into this role. But I would hear them, and I would affirm that I'm listening, and we would be taking notes. I'd have sometimes somebody taking notes for me if I wasn't taking it for myself, but allowing different ways also for them to provide feedback. So when we had listening sessions, if they felt comfortable sharing that in a whole group session, they could. We also had note cards as well that we had on tables, so they could write things down and share them anonymously, so that they wouldn't be felt like, some people felt like if they shared it publicly, or if they were the ones to share something that maybe was negative, that there was going to be some sort of a negative feedback on them, or negative thinking about them, and it wasn't that case. I made sure to make sure to let them know to speak freely, to speak openly, because this is what was going to then be driving the process moving forward. And one of the things that came up was that the appraisals were not aligned to the work, and I heard that over and over and over again. So when we met with employees to tell them, we're going to be implementing a new system, we're going to be redesigning the appraisal, one of the things I'm hearing consistently across the board through my, listening walks, what I call listening walks or listening tours, is that the appraisals are not aligned to your work. And I would say to the employees in those meetings that as the first thing is there anybody in here that disagrees with that statement?
Mm.
I can tell you maybe out of 10 or 15 different listening groups or meetings with employees, I never had an employee raise their hand to say that that wasn't something that was
Right.
an accurate statement. The appraisal doesn't align with my work, or the
Mm-hmm.
appraisal doesn't really is not representative of what I do. So,
Mm-hmm.
and when you're able to kind of provide factual information, and
Mm-hmm.
again, it was a mandate, it was something that we were going to do anyway, but it's the way that we approached it. I think that's important, is the approach, and just being able to be open to want to be able to hear that, to set time
Mm-hmm.
aside to be able to do that. That's important, because again, listening to your stakeholders to me was probably one of the best ways that we were able to
Mm.
then be able to push this through without as much feedback. I mean, without as much kickback, or without as much hesitation or resistance.
From your experience around this, it sounds like one of the key issues with the old system was just not lack of alignment to the work. What are like the top three things that you would share are like issues that you noticed that needed to be fixed?
So one of the biggest issues, aside from them not being aligned to the work, is that some employee groups were allowed to complete their appraisals paper and pen, and
Mm-hmm.
some were required to do electronically. So one of the
Mm.
other things that we did was we changed the appraisal had to all be completed electronically. There
Mm.
was no choice to be able to do it on paper and pen anymore. And we
Wow.
had some resistance from some employee groups about that, because again, what they would share with me is, we've been doing it this way for 15 years. We've been doing this way for 20 years. Why are we changing it now? But again, we had information and we were able to provide
Mm-hmm.
feedback to them as to the reasons why. So I think the second one was, again, moving from all paper, some mostly paper, pen, to electronic. And I think that the third thing was having a policy and a procedure in place. So we had a policy and procedure in place for teachers and for the teaching appraisal, but we didn't have a policy and procedure that was developed and in place for all non-teaching employees. So we ended up going through, after we created the process and getting that feedback, of then implementing a policy and a procedure that was specifically giving guidance about the appraisal process for non-teaching employees. And I think that was very helpful.
What do you believe is kind of the life cycle or the expiration date for one of these like review systems? Like, how do you know when it's time to fix or update or improve? Like, what are some of the key indicators someone should be looking for?
Sure. One of the first things that we did, and we don't have any methodology around this, I would say it's just our personal choice. And this was actually after talking to, our staff, was 2 years. So every 2 years, we have the appraisals on a cycle where they come up for review. And what we mean
Mm.
by that is that we actually then go pull the job description that's aligned with that specific appraisal, make sure that there was no changes on the job description. That's kind of the first
Mm-hmm.
box. If there were no changes to the job description, or if there were changes, we made sure that those new changes were then aligned with what was already on the appraisal.
Mm-hmm.
If there was no changes, then what we do is we get feedback from employees. So we pick a random group of employees, send them a
Right.
anonymous survey to say, how's the appraisal working? Is it working? Is it not? What do you think is working well? What do you think is not working well? Is it aligned? Is it not aligned? We asked some very specific questions so that they would be able to answer that anonymously. But the other thing I think is important that we added into those every year, what we were doing is we're meeting with our position management department and asking position management to give us a list of newly positions that were created throughout the school year. And so as we're starting to then align the appraisals for those newly created positions, we're wanting to also make sure that those newly created positions, that they are truly aligned to the work. And if they're not
Mm-hmm.
aligned to that work, then what we'll do is during the summer, before the next school year, is to let the supervisor know that we're going to be pulling an employee group to
Mm-hmm.
start an appraisal review and appraisal process to develop a new appraisal for those newly created
Oh,
positions.
can you talk a little bit about how you see this work impacting the community that you guys are in?
Well, again, I think it goes back to, role models in the school. So you would have instructional assistants who then become teachers, or you have teachers who then become assistant principals or principals. You have bus drivers who maybe, promote through their, the bus monitor then becomes a bus driver. The bus driver then becomes a
Mm.
clerical
Yeah.
person, or goes to work in a different department. So our students or families are able to see that the workforce is invested, they're committed,
Uh,
not only committed to the work, committed to the district, but then that translates to commitment to students. And so I think that, having the confidence that they know these individuals they're working with their kids, definitely helps make them feel a little bit more secure about the individuals that are surrounding their students. But they also know that something good is going on in the school district when they see employees continuing to grow and employees that stay, and there's not such high attrition. Because when parents and families and students see turnover, the first thing they're thinking is something's wrong, something must not be right, because you wouldn't have employees leaving hand over fist. So it's definitely important, I think, for the image that it's a nonverbal image, but it's also something that's very important because, again, families, parents, kids, other people see, wow, people are sticking around. They stay around. They must do that for a reason. This is a good place. I think it's also a good image for the district as well.
Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
All right, welcome back. Did you hear that part about listening? That was a little joke. But anyway, a lot of times when we try to roll out these, performance management systems, I think the key piece of what Arnie was talking about is the fact that we really need to level set, train the coaches and appraisers that do this work. So often we just kind of roll out a performance management system and then tell everybody about it, but we spent so much time on what it looks like as opposed to training the humans that are actually going to deliver it. And so I think the biggest takeaway from this is we need to spend more time developing the people administrating or appraising through the performance management systems, and so that we could get quality evaluations and quality feedback to the people that work for us. So peace.